Network state is this term coined by the author of the book called Balaji, which is basically the idea of it is that there's this online communities that become so powerful and they do various things to actually gain diplomatic acknowledgement in the end. That's the end state of this. And then you actually have very much a lot of the same attributes and characteristics of a nation state, but it's embedded in the cloud, in which with diplomatic recognition as well, the idea of the network state is then to have like-minded individuals that form their own communities and then at the end acquire land.
Welcome to 88 Minds.
Yo!
What's happening, Z?
What's happening, brother?
Good.
Thank you.
Hey, Carel.
Awesome.
Hey, Carel, how you doing?
Good on you.
Good. Yeah, Carel, how you doing today, man? Maybe you just wanna give us a bit of a rundown. Me and Chaz are new to you. I know Sixpence does blockchain engineering, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe we just want to give a rundown what you do, who you are.
Yes, okay, cool. So I am founder of Sixpence, a company that, like you rightfully said there, does blockchain engineering. We specialize in auditing and accounting software. So we SaaS products, software as a service products, specifically to do auditing and accounting. We serve like regulators and accountants and auditors and banks and financial institutions and so on. So we're basically a bridge between blockchain data and financial institutions. If you think of a crypto transaction, like a Bitcoin transaction or an Ethereum transaction, or a transaction on Luna or Valor or Coinbase, they all look entirely different, and they look nothing like financial data. So we take that data, we transform it, and on the other side we get real, actionable, enforceable, auditable financial data. And one of the big use cases of that software is, for instance, proof of reserves.
Right.
So proof of reserves is a way. Ciaran, you and I need to chat about this now. So at some point as well, we need to unpack it. But proof of reserves is basically to show that an exchange is actually solvent, so they have more assets than total liabilities. And we've built some very, very interesting software around that. That's world class actually. That was funded by Coinbase.
Where would your chain analysis, when you're talking about this, I'm thinking like chain analysis, is it similar or is it a little bit different?
It is in a way similar, but chain analysis focuses more on like criminal investigative software, like to serve that specific need. So they are very good at de-anonymizing data. So they have addresses, for example, wallets and so on chain, which they know who the identities are. We also do that. We know a subset of the blockchain's identities, and we use that in various ways. But we're really strong at accounting, which is not what chain analysis does. So we're really strong at actually taking the data and then processing it into financial data. So one example that I can give you is like if you have 10 accounts at different exchanges and you're doing some wild stuff like perpetuals and leverage trading or whatever, and you have wallets and you're doing yield farming and liquidity provision and you're going wild on chain on Ethereum, for example, you have various tokens, and you're going to give me all of that, and then you're going to ask me what the historic balance was at the beginning and at the end of the financial year. Like that's difficult to figure out, right? Especially if you've been adventurous, and that's what our software can do. So we're very good at that kind of accounting. We can give you like running balances. We give you a statement that looks like a bank statement, for example.
Yeah.
Crazy. Ciaran, how are you doing?
I'm cold.
Yeah.
Where are you, Zaydan? You're somewhere exotic.
Hot.
Just got a little bit of an exotic background for today's pod. That's the reason. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think first on the docket is network states. Oh, Chaz, the chief product officer of 88. Maybe you just want to introduce yourself also. I don't think you've met Carel.
No.
Yeah.
Yes. So Chaz, I'm chief product officer at 88. Kind of just overlooking the entire product ecosystem. I've been in the space since 2019. Yeah, that's when I kind of made the full pivot from just making cool consumer apps into like fully being, blockchain orientated and blockchain focused. And yeah, over the past few years, I've built different exchanges, I've built tokenization protocols, I've built a bunch of different cool things, and that's kind of all led me to 88. And yeah, that's where I am now.
Very cool.
Ciaran, I think first on the docket is network states, and you wanted to bring this sort of subject to the table. And I think you had a couple of questions, but maybe specifically for Carel himself.
Welcome to everybody. And we're going to talk about network states, which is really a concept which is gaining a little bit of traction, I think, around the world, particularly in the crypto community. And I think it's very much in line with the philosophy that launched Bitcoin and this idea that you're going to have communities that develop built around sound money. But it's evolved quite far from that, where there are a lot of very interesting projects around the world now. Communities building up around not so much national borders, but in the digital space. And I'm going to go into a couple of examples of that in a little bit later. Maybe, Carel, you can kick off with, your understanding of what is a network state for people who are not familiar with this. And I have a slightly different view of how this might evolve and how it might actually take off. But do you want to kick off and give us your ideas of what is a network state?
Network state is this term coined by the author of the book called Balaji, which is basically the idea of it is that there's this online communities that become so powerful and they do various things to actually gain diplomatic acknowledgement in the end. That's the end state of this. And then you actually have very much a lot of the same attributes and characteristics of a nation state, but it's embedded in the cloud, in which with diplomatic recognition as well, the idea of the network state is then to have like-minded individuals that form their own communities and then at the end acquire land. It's actually, let me give you the premise if you don't mind. So let me tell you what builds up to that, and that'll actually explain what the network state really is. There's this book called The Sovereign Individual. So if you look at that shelf there, you'll see that there's two of them. Where my finger is now, I actually have another copy here. It's one of those books that I just buy the box so that I can just give them away to people because I think it's so powerful and it has such a huge influence on my own thinking. So that actually precedes the network state. So then the sovereign individual, let me give you a quick overview of what that is. There's a few theories at play in the book The Sovereign Individual, and by the way, it was written in 1998 or 1996, around about there. And it perfectly predicts what happened in the last 30 years, and then it also makes some predictions of what's going to happen. By the way, it also predicted Bitcoin almost exactly as it turned out to be in 2008. So there's one theory in that book which is very, very relevant here, and that is that the Roman Empire, if you go back, there's these cycles of governments and how they collapsed and how they grew and collapsed in the end. If we go back a couple of cycles, we look at the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire collapsed because the government of the time, which was basically the Catholic Church, became too powerful and large. So with power came a lot of corruption, inflation, overly centralized controls. Like, for instance, they would ban the printing press at the time, at the end of the Roman Empire, because the printing press was threatening a lot of jobs at the time because there was a lot of people actually writing. You can draw many parallels to that, to the late stages of the Roman Empire and where we are today. So after the Roman Empire, we had democracy. So democracy was amazing. Democracy just brought this influx of and this massive catalyst to economic growth across the world, but democracy democratic nation state at least relied on efficient taxation. So governments around the world had to fund the services that they delivered, and they had to coerce people into paying tax. Of course, but tax is not voluntary, right? But with time, tax became more and more inefficient and voluntary. Today, actually, a large part of the tax revenue is actually voluntary. So if you think about, and the government's influence and power only grew and grew and grew with democracy. Now, if you think about democracy of where we are today, think about South Africa. It's actually a great example, right? We are taxed today, so the government can deliver all kinds of services. But then we go and procure those same services: schooling, security, health, hospitalization, power nowadays, water is coming. So we procure all of that stuff with our after-tax money, which the government was supposed to provide with our tax money. So another big problem with democracy, so that's one thing. Another big problem with democracy is that even though only a subset of the population votes for the government of the time, they rule over 100% of the population. So if you think about South Africa, our ruling party, the ANC, they secured 80% of the people that actually rocked up to vote, or 40%, I mean. So that's a very small part, but they rule over 100% of the population. So you got to ask then, what is next? Okay, so what is if democracy now follows the same route as the Roman Empire, as the book predicts it will, and it will then fall? What is then next? What will replace democracy as we know it today? So then, the first thing you need to ask yourself, sorry, this is a long answer, but this is my longest one for today, I promise you.
No, please continue. Continue.
What will replace democracy as we know it today? We first have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of government? And the purpose of government, if you drill it down to first principles, like the anarcho-capitalists will define it, or the libertarians will define it, it only has one purpose, and that is to as a arbitrator of final resorts. So it's a dispute resolutor, right? So if there's a contract between me and you, and we disagree on what that contract says, or someone breaks the contract, then the government needs to step in and decide who's right and wrong. That's basically what they need to do. We don't need them for anything else. We definitely don't need them to build schools, because the private sector can do it better. We don't need them to provide power. We see that in South Africa. We don't need them to pick up our trash. We also see that in small towns in South Africa, where there's these localized groups that actually take over that function. So they don't need to do basic service. They don't need nothing else than to arbitrate contracts, okay? Now, some people might say that is a bit extreme, and they might nitpick examples of why governments are actually needed for more things. So I think if I can address that, I would say that let's at least agree broadly that governments today are severely overreaching, and that the anarcho-capitalist ideology is a bit maybe too far to the other side. But somewhere in the middle, there's a minimalist government that uses our tax money wisely and allows the economy to flourish. But we're very far from that. So now I'm getting to the network state. So then what is next? First, it's a parallel government, all right? That's what the sovereign individual also predicts. It's a parallel government. That's what we have today. So we have these parallelized service delivery organizations, like AfriForum, for example, is one. There's many of them. We also have private power provision. We have private water provision. We have private schools. We have private hospitals. We have private policing and security. So it's a parallel government. And at some point, this parallel government is going to become more powerful and popular than our actual government. And something's going to happen at that point. We also then have these small decentralized governments where actually a large part of the population, as close to as 100% as we can get, actually voted for the people that's delivering the services. Not only 40% of the people that rocked up to vote on the day every 4 years, right? So the world is becoming more and more independent of physical presence. So where we are today, we have huge amount of influence online, right? If you reverse back to the days before the internet, we only had like a very limited amount of influence. Our actions could only influence maybe our neighbors and their neighbors, like our immediate communities. We didn't have a voice that could reach the world. So that's an important data point. And then money is getting more and more out of state control. This is a key ingredient to where we are going. So money like Bitcoin, crypto, is not under the influence of government censorship and control. And if you take that ingredient away from governments, actually they become incredibly weak. Your tax payments are becoming more and more and more voluntary, because the ability to enforce tax is becoming less and less and less from government as the money is getting out of their control. Now, if that happens, then something very interesting happens. a government flips from an employer model, which is what we currently have. The governments are like our employer. We are like the employees. The government tells us what to do. We need to do that. Now, if we flip that around from a consumer and a business model, so that's what it's going to become. Because if my tax is voluntary, then it means that the government needs to compete for my tax money, all right? Because so it's like a business model. Now, when that happens, then then it means that I, with my heavy influence online and my limited physical dependencies, can form what is called then a network state. Myself and other individuals like us, we decide where we want to deploy our hard-earned capital, our tax money. And if that is not with the current government that rules over where I am physically, that's irrelevant. Because where I am physically is becoming irrelevant. Where I am in the cloud becomes more and more and more relevant. And now you have a proper functioning state that would, as the book describes it, in the end, have diplomatic recognition. And that is extremely, extremely powerful. You can probably, theoretically, have the most powerful nation in the world. And the government and the rules at which it's governed is agreed to by 100% of the population. If you don't agree with the rules, you just leave, right? And you join another nation state in the cloud. Not like it is currently. And that is theoretically, on paper, the perfect system and the system that will replace democracy.
Do you mind if I jump in here? Wow. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Carel. I think it gives really great context. I might be wrong, but this is where my mind went as you were explaining it. And I try to think of like, cool, like we're in South Africa right now. Could we almost draw a parallel to really understand like how network states are almost being, born and almost innovated? Immediately, I thought of a small town called Aranya, who also have now their own kind of way of working. They have their own way of basically governing that small little town of theirs, right? They almost seem completely independent from our current government system and how they deploy capital for education, for hospitals, for even as far as, going and basically almost collecting all of the residents' money, putting it at a bank, letting that earn interest, and then them almost using some sort of, like a different kind of currency to what South Africa's use, maybe to kind of like really bring it home. I don't know if I'm correct in saying that that's like an early stage, example of like of a network state, but I don't know, maybe you can like maybe run that parallel and see if there's any, parallels with that.
Just, Carol, before you answer that, I think network states seem very foreign to most people. Like, it's almost like this dystopian future that people just completely can't understand and probably will never get to because they just don't understand it. But I think one of the examples before this call that I've seen online is that everything actually is a network state currently as we live right now. I mean, the fact that we can communicate geographically different locations and have a general consensus online in some form or way is probably some sort of network state. This four-way call is a community-based network state. So there's this argument that we are already there, and the only thing that's stopping it from scaling to a point of large network states to 1 million, 3, 4 million, 10 million people that has some sort of sovereign power within the physical world is the fact that there is no ways of verification. And the future way or the current way of verification is cryptographic consensus. So everything's limited by smart contracts. Currency exchange is cryptocurrency. And then there's the argument that if AI or AI agents were to take over, AI agents kind of play the automation role in click, click, beep, boop, up, but that whole process is automated. So we're not clicking any types of physical hardware machines. It's kind of all automated. But at some point, the cryptographic or the cryptography or the cryptocurrencies is the verification mechanism of all those automations that are happening online between different individuals and communities. So the argument was that we are in network states, and it's just about having either the AI agents, both the AI agents and the cryptography for it to scale to large sovereign powers that can have an influence in the physical world. Yeah. What do you think about that?
You're muted
Sorry,
there,
you're on mute.
Carel.
Oh, apologies. To answer Chaz, I think that you are 100% correct. South Africa is probably 10 to 15 years ahead of the rest of the world in becoming this decentralized nation state. And it's just a force of nature that we've ended up being the leader in the world of this. I think it's a coincidence, but we are. So we have probably the fastest collapsing government in the world, but also coupled with probably the strongest and most resilient private sector in the world. And I think those two concepts actually brings it together to have all of these models, like for instance, Urania being one of them. But I think there's others as well. Just small rural South Africa is an example in its own way. People are just doing things on their own, basic services as well. But like I also said, like us being so used to just procuring government services with our after tax money. So then I think that to get to your point there, Zaydan, I also 100% agree that, look, if you think about the premise of this is that, first of all, there's a couple of things. First of all, government has a monopoly on violence. There's also one of the theories of the sovereign individual. And the premise of violence is that it is much more expensive to defend yourself against violence than it is to exert violence. So if you think about it, a bullet costs 1 rand. But to defend yourself against a bullet costs infinity, right? It costs way more than 100. Or 1 rand. It's orders of magnitude more expensive to defend yourself against that. But cryptography flips that around. So cryptography is very, very cheap to actually secure yourself, but it's extremely expensive to attack that. So the attack costs is now, for the first time in the history of humankind, more expensive than the cost to defend. All right, so that's the theoretical backdrop of it. Now, if you think about cryptography, smart contracts, governance, again, on the theoretical point of view, there's something that the most remarkable thing about Bitcoin is that it allowed people that do not necessarily trust each other to cooperate because the game theory was correct. Now they can agree on something. So even if I can run a Bitcoin node, you run a Bitcoin node, Zaydan, we don't necessarily trust each other, but we can both agree on the state of the Bitcoin node because the game theory and the incentives are aligned so that we can agree on that. That is actually remarkable. Now, if you take that same theory where two people can agree on something and you put that into governance, into real world governance, then you get to a point where you can actually reach consensus between non-trusting participants in the real world. Let me give you a very, very elementary example. So let's say there's two little boys, right? They're brothers. They both, my kids are between 3 and 5 years old. So I'm going to use that age gap. Let's say they are 4 years old because I know how difficult 4-year-old can be. So you have two brothers and their mother gives them a chocolate and tells them, you guys need to divide this chocolate. All right, each get a piece. There's a few ways you can solve this problem. So first of all, you can use violence. That's how we typically solve problems. So the two boys fight over it, and the strongest one, he grabs a chocolate and he runs and it's his. Okay, that's one way to solve this problem. Another way to solve this problem is to appoint a dictator. So we typically do that as well. So the mother becomes the dictator. She decides you're gonna be the you're getting the chocolate, or she divides it into half, and the two boys need to be satisfied whether the pieces were equal or not. It's like an authoritarian leader type of style. Or another way, which is decentralized protocol, is to tell the one boy you gotta cut it in half, and the other one gets to choose the piece first. Now you're aligning game theory here and incentives, such that the one that's cutting the piece is incentivized to cut it exactly in half. And for this process to be as free and fair as possible, because if he cheats, he's the one that's going to lose out. So like that protocol is an example of taking the incentives that exist and putting it into the real world. And now we can all agree, even though we don't trust each other, we can all agree that we were treated fairly in the process.
Yeah, I think there's a very good example of an interesting point that you raised there about South Africa being the fastest collapsing government in the world. I never quite thought of it that way. I was recently just researching something about land grabs in South Africa. And this really does come back to the whole game theory principles. where there's a number of areas in the country where land grabs are particularly violent and aggressive, and it's happening quite a lot in the Western Cape, which is DA run, and it makes it a little bit unusual. The DA normally well known for pretty good governance, but there you have criminal gangs which are basically invading land. And here's where the game theory comes in: is that you have this act in South Africa called PI, which is the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act. It was introduced in the wake of apartheid, basically because black people were being thrown off land unlawfully, without court orders, without eviction orders. So they brought in this act, very good act, intended to protect people against this kind of thing. But of course, what has happened is you have this legal principle called spoliation, where if I take something from you unlawfully, and I keep it, you don't have a right to reclaim that property. So if I rob you on the street, and then I run away, and 2 months later you find me in the street and you try to rob me back, well, I would have a case against you. So you have this concept called spoliation and counter-spoliation. Basically what it means that if you occupy someone...
Ciaran, I think maybe you're covering your mic a bit.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, that's fine now.
Okay. So if I occupy land and you don't kick me off within 24 hours, I have entitlement to stay on that land, even though I don't own it. And this is the problem that we're facing in South Africa today. Now, when I started looking at how these things could be resolved in a better way, the people who are living on those land, they're desperate, they're poor, but they're being sold. You've got these mafias, these criminal gangs that are selling land that doesn't belong to them. There is this fairly interesting development happening in the blockchain space, which is online judicial practice. There's an organization called Kleros that was founded in 2017, basically a decentralized arbitration platform built on the Ethereum blockchain. And so that they resolve disputes mainly related to e-commerce, insurance, decentralized finance, and that kind of thing. But what you do is you submit your dispute via a smart contract. And usually these things can be resolved with a yes-no answer. Where it gets a little bit more nuanced, these things are more difficult to do. But there's thousands of cases now being solved by organizations like Kleros, where there's financial incentives as well. So you join in, but the financial incentives are game theoried, that you have to come up with an honest answer. So now they're incorporating AI into some of these systems as well, where they'll take all the metadata, they'll pull it together, and they will come up with solutions. I'm basically mentioning this because this is kind of the network state, one of the solutions the network state is coming up with. But there are others. If you go back earlier in time, gaming, people were playing League of Legends and that sort of thing. They developed these communities right across national borders. And, my son, for example, he's very good friends with people in the UK and Chile and Brazil and all over the world. They operate in they agree on things that I have no idea what they're talking about. But that is a kind of an example of a network state. You talked about The Sovereign Individual, which I have read, and it is a great book because it does lay out the decline of the nation state. And the nation state is really a creature of European colonial philosophy in the 1800s, and here we are today. Look at Congo, which has got borders which encapsulates maybe 60, 70 different ethnic groups, different languages. They don't always get on. But I like the idea of, South Africa is also an interesting mix of peoples. We have certain things that we agree on, and we have certain things that we don't agree on. The Cape Independence Movement is an example of people trying to split away. Oranje is another case. People trying to, develop their own community with their own set of rules. And I do agree with Carel that the cryptography and private monies like Bitcoin make this more possible. And you see this race happening at the moment where regulators are trying to catch up to this technology, but they're always about 10 steps behind. Recently, we've had the travel rule introduced here for all crypto asset service providers. You guys at 88 will know this because you've got to comply with it. Any transaction over 5,000 Rand, you've got a KYC, know your customer on both ends of that transaction. And well, you can straight away see there's some people who don't want to be known. They want to be anonymous in this space. So they're going to move to decentralized markets where they don't have to do these types of things. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on. By the way, another good book on this was Democracy: The God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe, where he goes into this the whole democratic process is, and you see this pretty much in most countries around the world, where you end up with a kind of a 51-49 split. I'm exaggerating. Sometimes it's a bit better than that, where you've got the population divided in half, and governments have kind of figured out how to game that one as well. How do we end up all the time with government that is basically capturing votes by appealing to some baser instincts? We're going to give you stuff for free. We're going to take from the guys who have, and we're going to give to the guys that don't. So I think the network state is very much a libertarian or anarcho-capitalist movement. And there are communities that are developing. Bitcoin Akasi is an example. Yes, they live within South Africa. You've got communities like this in Brazil and Argentina, El Salvador. You've got that Bitcoin community there. People are trying this. It's very experimental, but I think it's going to grow.
Carel, before we move on to the next topic of Bitcoin mining, I was interested in what you said of the chocolate example, where the person cuts the chocolate in half and the consensus basically plays the game theory that the other person can choose which piece he wants. That's sort of comparing the physical world with a consensus that's online. How would you verify that person actually cut? Oh wait, okay. I think I came up with the answer now, because obviously the other person would be able to pick the bigger piece first eventually. Okay, that makes sense. I was just thinking about that.
The incentive for the guy cutting it is that he cuts it fairly.
Right. Makes perfect sense.
So Carel, it feels like network states. So we're kind of moving from this centralized governance to decentralized governance, and having a lot more smaller communities decide how they want to be led, in a sense, right? Something interesting that you said, it's almost as if this idea almost manifests digitally, and then eventually you can buy land, right? And that then manifests physically after that, right? So what are the risks of that, right? Like, what are the risks of having too many decentralized communities that are governing themselves? Is there a risk in the future where they might be stepping on each other's toes, that there might be, almost like a war between, different communities? Obviously, there's a lot of upside to it. And just thinking about it, I love the fact that you mentioned that, we have one of the fastest collapsing governments, but one of the most resilient private sectors. That decentralization of governance becomes a lot of different private sectors that are, managing and governing themselves. But where does that, what's the risk of that growing too big, and each one of these individual governance communities are stepping on each other's toes? And I don't know if the book goes into what are the risks to that, and how does that look like in the future when everyone feels like their voice is more powerful than the next, right?
Yeah. Chad, I think you hit the nail on the head with that question. I think that there's one piece where I actually heavily disagrees with Balaji, the author, is that it should manifest in land, because he says that it's online first and land last. Whereas currently it's the other way around, but that's what the book says. The book is very, very practical in that sense. It gives these step-by-step guides and plays out exactly how it will happen. In my mind, it's too detailed in that front. Once you start predicting on that level, you're probably wrong. Even the sovereign individual made some very bad predictions, in terms of Y2K and so on. It's it's going to a lower level, and I think they are dead wrong in that sense. I think in actual fact, if you do start localizing network states onto land, if you do start populating land, it severely weakens the potential impact that network state can have. Online, we are flexible. We can move from one place to another. We can voluntarily join and leave within seconds or milliseconds. We can even automate these kind of things. If we don't agree, then we don't want to do that or that. Once you have a physical establishment, then you are bound, physically bound. And that's the last thing we want to do, in my mind. Is like we want to become as independent of our physical presence as possible. I think that's how the future will play out as well. The sovereign individual actually recommends that with the birth of the internet, that you do actually sell all physical assets that you have, that you rent a house, and that you keep all of your assets and wealth in the cloud, in cyber money, as it calls it, because it didn't know what Bitcoin would be called, of course, but it did predict cyber money and cyber assets. And I 100% agree with that. That's the way you should do. I don't think that the network state should ever be bound to any physical location. Wars? That's a good question. I haven't actually thought about that. But I suppose that, yes, there will definitely be wars. It will be cyber wars, of course. And like that's an interesting thought experiment as to what would then happen.
Well, I think also the sovereign individual and democracy, the god that fell, they make the point that government has the monopoly on violence. Excuse me. And this is kind of a way of removing that capacity, because wars are a product of a very corrupted financial system. In the fiat system that we have. Just look at what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. Would that be possible without a fiat system where the American government can print money to finance its war machine? The same goes for the Europeans, and you've got all these other countries that are not really involved in this, that don't have big, big military budgets. When you have sound money, you've withdrawn that power, that ability to fund this war machine. And you can see that a lot of these conflicts are created by third-party influence. There's somebody external that is driving that up. And it's plain as day to anybody looking at this what is going on here. There's a huge amount of money laundering going on in the military space. And with as a sovereign individual, and with Bitcoin as kind of the soundest money maybe that we have, there's a different future. There's a potentially different future there. But I think the other thing that we are going to have to confront at some point is, when has government overstepped its power? So you mentioned that what is their primary function? It's as an arbitrator of disputes. Okay, so that really falls to the judiciary. I would say that the primary function of government is, one, that it protects private property. Two, it takes care of foreign policy. All the other things that you've mentioned, like providing power and providing schooling, that can be done much better in the private sector. And we don't even need to argue that. There's all the evidence shows that to be true, particularly in South Africa. So it's really scaling back the power of government. And the only way you can really do that is when they run out of the financial means to do it. Look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, where the tax department, every day there's an article, SARS, South African Revenue Services, is focusing on this group and they're focusing on that group, and they're trying to grab as much money, and every government in the world is trying to do exactly the same thing. And there will come a point when you get already this kind of jurisdictional arbitrage where or tax arbitrage, people are moving to jurisdictions with lower tax rates. At some point, and there is a counter movement to that, because there's a lot of sharing of information going on between tax departments around the world. They're trying to close in on these loopholes and close down the tax arbitrage. But you're getting jurisdictional arbitrage as well, where if one country is hostile towards crypto, the miners move. They move from China to Texas and to other places around the world. And that's what we're going to see. There's going to be this arbitrage going on, I think, until you do get more and more collapses of the state.
Yeah, like even as you were talking now, Ciaran, it's almost like people are starting to realize at a very deep level that they're being failed by their local government, and then start to think, how can they, again, become a sovereign individual? I think this is really pushing people, and I think with the vision of the sovereign individual, we're kind of moving into a world where like people will prefer to be globalists and not really tied to like a specific place, right? They would rather be where they want to be, surrounded by people who align with their visions, et cetera, et cetera. And if they think that's Texas, cool. They just want that option, right? If the decision is Puerto Rico for less taxes, that's the consensus there, then that's where they would want to go and, work from, right? So yeah, I definitely think, and I'm even seeing it, especially with the younger generation, this idea of like, why do we have to listen to government? Why do I have to be, confined to like one space? I want to be a citizen of the world, so to speak, right? Is this what this is empowering? Is this what the next shift in social is?
Yeah, I also want to add on to that. If it is the case that everyone gets onto the internet and sort of has these different pockets of network states, wouldn't that mean that China, being an economical powerhouse, a manufacturing powerhouse, a goods powerhouse, be continue to rise and continue to grow because sort of everybody's relying on this consensus on the internet and sort of China is powering the physical goods economy? Or does that change? Does Carol, maybe you would know more about this. Would that change? Would people have their own pockets of physical good manufacturing? Would they rely on their own local communities? But I wouldn't see that as the case because everyone's sort of geographically spread out.
I think that the true globalization, which is what we're moving towards, that's where I actually don't agree with you, Ciaran. Like I don't feel like foreign policy is part of the government's mandate, because I believe that we are moving towards a much more globalized model, in my opinion. So I think it's actually it's a much smaller part of what they should do. But then true globalization requires actually three things. It requires free flowing of goods. It requires free flowing of information across borders. And then the last one, which we don't have yet, is it requires free flowing of money across borders. And that's the last piece towards globalization, because we've had free flowing of goods since the invention of the container, really. The internet brought us on information free flow, and now crypto brings us money. So I think that first of all, being a true global powerhouse comes down not to the ownership of the manufacturing of goods and services or the raw material production or whatever. Being a true powerhouse comes down to only one thing, and that is, do you have reserve currency status or not? That's the only thing that really matters, right? So and I don't believe that China will ever have that privilege. I think Ray Dalio predicts that that the renminbi would actually become the reserve currency, and there's a few others as well. But I don't believe that they are right. China does not have trust. Like even a bigger factor than the emergence of Bitcoin and crypto is the lack of trust in China. And for you to have the world's reserve currency, you need trust. That's a main ingredient in having that privilege and earning that and maintaining that privilege. Is you need to have trust in your Federal Reserve, and that you will not inflate the currency away, because now I hold dollars, right? Now I trust that the Fed will not inflate it away. So and that it will actually maintain its purchasing power over time. And China is way too closed. Like no one knows what's going on there. The CCP is not sharing any sort of information. So they will never gain that level of trust from industry and from corporate West. Now, something that will gain that trust and is gaining it at a very fast pace is Bitcoin. So I believe that Bitcoin will become the world's reserve currency. And then there is no nation state that can actually garner the power that you described, Zaydan. I don't think that the means for manufacturing is anything near as powerful as reserve currency status.
Carl, so let's say someone is between 18 and 30 years old watching this, right? How should they be thinking about network states now? Especially, someone between 18 and 30 might even have kids, or maybe 18 to 35, the youth. Let's just take the youth, right? How should we be thinking about network states and how we should be moving over the next decade, right? What are the key takeaways to take of all of this? Like, cut through the theory, let's get like super practical. If this is something where the world is moving towards right now, it's very like a small pace, but we can start to see the smaller use cases. But over the next 10, 15, 20, maybe even 50 years, we'll really start to see that, the true network effect of these network states, right? How should we be thinking about this now, even if it's at a very small level? And how should we be navigating this new world that's ever shifting?
I was born in 1989, and I just yesterday had a conversation with a friend of mine of how out of touch we are now with today's youth. The Zoomers and so on. Like it
Yeah.
is It actually feels to me like, from what I read online and from my experiences, is that today's youth, for some weird reason, prefers socialism. It's like I don't understand why. It's like, why you have all the knowledge in the world that you prefer that kind of ideology. So I'm very much out of touch with them, and I realized yesterday that I can't necessarily give advice on the level that they need it. But I would say that, following at least from the mistakes that I've made, and in hindsight now, you should really try to limit your physical dependency on anything. Like, try to eliminate all kinds of dependencies. Don't buy property, because why? You are dependent on the local municipality and on the national government for title deeds and things like that. Like, don't do that. Don't try in the cloud, in the international era. Don't deploy your skills, on a local level if you can. Like, if you're a plumber or an electrician, I mean, I think you're on the right track in any case, because the world's always going to need plumbers and electricians. So that's a bit of an exception. But if you use the internet to earn your income at all, if you do remote work, for example, try not to do them in a location where you are physically bound. Like, try to deploy it in the cloud and earn international income, or better yet, earn Bitcoin and crypto, and keep your assets out of any centralized control and build up wealth in that way as well. Like, I think that's the advice that I would give to young people. The world is so big. And there's that meme that says, do you know that you can just do stuff? Like, that's a powerful meme. You can just do stuff. You should open your mind and your frame of reference to this massive globe that we have. Don't be stuck in your immediate surroundings.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. My son is a developer, and he sold his company to an American group, and it always staggers me when his clients. He does integration, but basically, it's not too different from what you're doing, Carel, for accounting packages like NetSuite. And integration is that I always find amazing is how people make money. And you think coffee, well, that's a market that's already saturated. No, it isn't. There's people coming up with new types of coffee, new ways of brewing. Even the devices, the cappuccino machines and things like that. There's people doing irrigation systems where you think, well, that's already been developed. Everybody's making better mousetraps all the time. And you see this everywhere. It's like, don't be intimidated because you see a market that looks like it's well covered. Just go for it. If you've got an angle and you can go in there and disrupt that, then you should do it, because that is how the world progresses, is better ideas all the time coming to the forefront and just smashing through the status quo. And you mentioned about the resilience of the private sector. I look at the young people in South Africa, and they amaze me, actually, the ingenuity, the way that they come up with business ideas, particularly in this digital age. Chaz, you mentioned that you were involved in setting up exchanges and blockchain development and all that kind of thing. I was never in that. I admire that, because out of that, you probably have 9 out of 10 failures, but one idea that does come through. And I think you've got to take a few knocks, on the head and just see what works and what doesn't work, and don't be afraid of that failure.
That is so true. The other day, I actually read something. You're always going to fail if you try something new. It's inevitable. You're going to fail. The question is, how many times are you going to fail? There's a finite amount. It's not infinite. If you knew that you're going to fail 10 times before you're going to get it right, then what are you going to do? You're going to try and fail as fast as possible.
True.
To iterate through
Very
that.
true. Very true.
Like, failure is incredibly good. There's such a negative connotation to failure, but failure is excellent. Failure is growth.
Can we, before we wrap up here, we are coming up to the hour, but let's just tackle this one. Carel, you're a former Eskom engineer, and I interviewed you some time back, and we wrote the story, which got a lot of traction actually around the world. And it was, what would have happened if Eskom, our South African power utility, had gone into Bitcoin mining in 2019? You came up with some staggering figures that if they had done that, even on a fairly, I wouldn't say modest scale, it would have to be on a fairly large scale, but it wouldn't be using all of their surplus power during the off-peak times, that they would have paid off their debt, which is about 460 billion rand, maybe just quickly run us through those figures?
In 2018, I wrote a blog post, it's still online, of why Eskom should mine Bitcoin, and I turned it into a proposal. I gave it to them. They laughed me out of the room. Understandably, it was a very wild idea at the time.
Yeah.
But, you know, fast forward 7 years later, and I was recently in the office, or I don't want to say who, but some extremely high and influential people inside the organization wanting to hear more. So, so it shows you how the narrative have changed over 7 years, right? So then, as a thought experiment, I ran some numbers. I got some information about the power availability in South Africa, and I ran some simulations. And I said, okay, made a few assumptions, and I said, okay, if Eskom started mining in 2020, 5 years ago, and they allocated only surplus power. So it's only when now a lot of people challenge me on this. They say, well, how does Eskom have surplus power? You know, we have load shedding. That's true. But if you make the assumption that you would not mine during load shedding, you'll only mine where there's actual surplus power available on the grid. It goes to waste in many cases. In any case, and you
How
allocate
often is it that we have surplus power?
so it depends on how much. So let's take a number. Let's say 2,000 megawatt. That's the number that I chose, right? So 2,000 megawatt, you would have had 2,000 megawatt available at least 70% of the time since 2020, if you run the numbers. So about 30% of the time, it's not available, and you assume that you're not mining, right? That's load shedding, that's gas turbines that's running, things like that. So so only cheap power, by the way. All right. So then you come to about availability of about 70%. Then so if you take that and then you say, okay, Eskom built 2,000 megawatts of mining capacity in 2020, and they allocated that. The capital cost would have been about $1 billion at the time. And to date, they would have mined around 400,000 Bitcoin. All right. So if they were to sell half of that in real time, so at the prevailing spot price at the time, then they would have made about 400 billion rand. So I'm mixing my dollars and rands here. So just try to keep a cool head here. So they would have been debt free, and they would have basically still have 200,000 Bitcoin in custody, right? If they only sold half, which is another 800 billion rand. Yes. No, 400 billion rand, sorry. 400 billion rand. So they would have been debt free and have 400 billion rand in treasury, in capital available. Now you can do various kind of things. You can say, okay, they only sell 25%, or they only sell at a high price or at a low price, whatever. I try to be conservative in all my assumptions, and just assume that they sell at the spot price. No funny business, no trading, no whatever, no arbitrage, no nothing. Only with available surplus cheap power. And then the numbers are just staggering. It's like that would have actually put South Africa on a double-digit growth path, if you think about it.
Yeah, and there we're talking about the economy growing at 10% more or more per year. And you think about that, and you think about the lost opportunity there. And I can totally understand, look, if I was running Eskom, or, I was Andre de Ruyter at the time, and you come in with this crazy idea what we could do, I mean, I would listen to it. But, you've got government as the shareholder. And what are they going to say to this? They obviously, they did lock you out of the room, I'm pretty sure. But now they're looking at it differently. Do you have any idea if they are looking at it seriously now?
They are seriously looking at it, yes. I think that it is taking long, as with all things government, in South Africa. And it's frustrating as to how long it's taking, especially if you see the other countries coming online and getting it. Like every day there's a new one that's coming online, and mining with state. I think the most recent one was actually Pakistan, mining with state-owned resources and surplus power and so on. So you see them popping up all over the place, and our government will likely think about it for at least another decade before taking action. But it is definitely on their radar. Yeah.
Right. It's not that there's no precedent for this. I mean, you mentioned Pakistan getting into it. I think Texas has got a power utility which is doing this as well. And they are doing it more and more because they realize this is I can understand going back a few years ago, Bitcoin, it's so volatile. What do you end up with? Like anybody getting into Bitcoin for the first time, you think this is probably the craziest thing I've ever done. You come across people who were mining Bitcoin. I know people who mined 60 Bitcoin on their personal computers back in the day, and then when it got to $150, sold it.
That's crazy.
And then they're looking at, I would have been financially independent if I'd hung on to that. But nobody really foresaw or had trust in the system back then. And I think this does come back to the point you made. Bitcoin is proving itself in terms of trust, and it is growing and because of that. Anything further? That was fascinating, Carel. Thank you for taking us through those numbers, both on the network state and what would have happened if Eskom had gone into Bitcoin mining in 2020. Anybody else want to say something at this point? Chaz?
Yeah, no, it's interesting how that at the time it may have felt like a big decision, but that small decision could have literally just changed like the entire trajectory of that entire department of government. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Turning excess power into money, which then funds itself to get out of debt and improve infrastructure. It's really a no-brainer. It'll be a shame if they do take another 10 years to think about it, man. It would be a damn shame. Yeah. But yeah, really interesting, Carl. I think I've got a really good understanding of network states now. I think, and the reason why I asked that last question is like, just how should we be thinking about this practically, even if it's on a small scale? And I think you answered it beautifully. This idea of like really just detaching yourself from all physical dependency. It's an interesting thought, but very scary at the same time. It feels like a bit of a jump to what we've been taught. I think there's a lot of unlearning to relearn, right, to do. And yeah, thanks so much for your insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate you hosting me as well. It was a lot of fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Zaydan, did you want to say something?
I don't have any comments with regards to the Bitcoin mining Eskom, but obviously at this point it would be a no-brainer. I mean, a couple of years ago it was obviously not so much of a no-brainer, but generally so. I think after 2025 things are going to change rapidly. I think more and more young people are realizing that you can just do stuff, and I think that's important. Like, I think me and Chaz are in similar generations, and I think just all of our friends, people that we know, the community that 88 has built, they just realize, oh damn, we can just do shit, and we can just do shit on the internet, and nobody's stopping us. There's no obligatory, there's no red tape. I can just create stuff. And I think that's the coolest part about our generation. Obviously, we have our downsides for sure. Seeing that just makes the future super exciting. But nonetheless, Kara, thank you for the time. Thank you for going into things. Thanks, Ciaran. Thank you also for hosting, be part of this as well. Yeah, guys, it was fun.
Good.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And
thank you, guys.
Great discussion. I got a lot out of it. I think we all did.
Same.
Awesome,
Thanks,
guys.
Okay.
Take care.
Cool, guys.
So
Welcome to 88 Minds.